Mom is forced to bury 4-year-old son. 5 years later, she has a dream that changes everything. Dave and Jane Daulton's van may not be big enough to comfortably accommodate all their children, but this couple's hearts are beyond the right size to provide enough love for each one of them. The Daultons have 9 children and currently live in their Western Branch home. All of them have Down syndrome. Let's start this amazing story. But before we start, don't forget to hit the like button and also subscribe to our channel to get some interesting stuff. The family's 12-passenger van, a 2003 Chevrolet with 229,000 miles, was adequate years ago, but now with older children and frequent mechanical problems, a new form of transportation is desperately needed. The 700 Club had started a campaign to help the family raise the $60,000 needed to purchase a new van. More than $15,000 has been raised so far. The Daultons are very grateful for the help. Dave and Jane, who have known one another since childhood in Pennsylvania, have 5 biological children: Mike, Brian, Bill, Tommy, and Liz, in addition to their adopted children. For Dave and Jane Daulton, life is good. They have 5 healthy kids and expecting their 6th. During the pregnancy, Jane and Dave found out that their next child, Tommy, would be born with Down syndrome. The parents were shocked and didn't know what it would mean for them and their family, but they quickly decided to make the most of the situation. They didn't know what their life would look like in the future, but they knew they'd be there for each other and their kids. Life wasn't always easy, but Dave and Jane loved Tommy just as much as their other children. Then, not long after Tommy was born, the family suffered a major tragedy. 4-year-old Brian needed cardiac surgery and had an allergic reaction to the anesthesia during surgery. He ended up in a coma and died only 3 days later. The family was devastated, and it took a long time for things to return to normal. The years passed, but then something strange happened. For several nights in a row, Jane had the same dream. She saw a child with Down syndrome and felt the child needed her help. After the 3rd night of having the same dream, she knew she had to do something. The next day, Jane and Dave called an adoption agency. At first, they were told there was a long wait, but the same evening they got a call. A family had backed out of an adoption, and the agency wondered if Jane and Dave could imagine jumping in instead. The couple was overjoyed. Ben was just a few weeks old when Jane and Dave got him. Just like Tommy, he was born with Down syndrome. Everyone in the family fell in love with him, and even when they were told that Ben had heart trouble, Jane and Dave weren't discouraged. They adopted him, despite the sense of loss they felt after their 2nd son had died a few years earlier. Jane and Dave found so much pleasure in taking care of children with Down syndrome, and they continued to adopt. In 1995, they adopted a little girl named Emily, and then Lanny, and the family continued to grow. In time, and completely by chance, Dave Daulton, who is an adoption consultant with Haven Law Group, started working with a couple who has ties to an orphanage in Ukraine. They wanted Dalton to be a part of it. The Daultons traveled there, searched through the books of adoptable children, and didn't see any with Down syndrome. I asked where they were, he said, and they said, who would want them? I said, we would. That led them on another path to help children thousands of miles away. Here there are parents looking for kids, Dave Daulton said, and there are kids looking for parents. The Daultons became those parents when they registered and were approved to adopt Ukrainian children with Down syndrome. Anya, now 16, became their first international adoption and the first with Down syndrome to ever be adopted from that country. She was 2 years old and weighed just 13 pounds when she became a Daulton. Jack, now 18, was the next Ukrainian child they adopted in 2001. And 7 months later, their pleading to adopt Philip, now 19, was met with acceptance. The couple had gone to see what the Ukrainians call a Level 4 facility, where children referred to as defective are sent. We were horrified, Jane Daulton said. We felt we could not leave this alone. And that led the couple to committing to help change the deplorable conditions in which such children live. Dave became missions director for Father's Heart, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping orphans and homeless children throughout the world. Starting in 2002, the Daultons traveled to the Ukrainian orphanage year after year, supplying wheelchairs, educators, and speech therapists, anything and everything they could to make it better. Then they found out that in Ukraine, children with Down syndrome are usually given up by their parents and forced to live their entire lives in orphanages. They thought their adoption days were over until they heard about a Ukrainian girl who needed a family. Because of their ages, and with Jane having survived a bout of cancer found in her leg in 2011, the Daultons didn't think they'd be approved for another adoption. But they were, and not just for one child, but 2. Marina Joy, now 13, joined the family 3 years ago, and Molly, now 14, who caught their eye in the orphanage at the same time, came home with them too. We just love to watch them grow and blossom, Jane Daulton said. They've given us so many blessings, Dave Daulton added, and it's unbelievable the love we get from them in return. They have an insight into people that we just don't have. From a normal-sized family, the Daultons are now a huge family with 15 children, including 12 with Down syndrome. Some of the couple's children have even started their own families. Today, Jane and Dave are delighted to have found their calling. Let's share another story of a bus driver. Working as a bus driver is not an easy job. Your duty is to shuttle kids to and from school, but sometimes you have to deal with the behavioral problems of children. Bus drivers are not only responsible for keeping your children safe, but they also take an active role in discipline and care. Driving for the school system was a rewarding experience for Cindy Clausen, especially when she observed some students stepping up and helping their fellow peers. Two students made a huge impact on Cindy's life, and she felt their parents needed to know. The environment of her home was not stable and had a domino effect in Cindy's life and impacted her ability to make connections with people. When she was about to start high school, she went to a new house where she was surprised to see the owner. Cindy realized that this older woman was no stranger, and luckily it was her grandmother. Cindy's grandmother hugged her granddaughter with tears in her eyes. She couldn't believe that after all these years they finally met. Cindy had last seen her grandmother many years ago when her mother, Sally, suddenly had decided to take them across country. They fell out of contact. Cindy's grandmother said she'd never given up hope in the situation. She constantly checked social services to locate her. Now they could start a new life. Unfortunately, Cindy's life was not stable. She struggled in school life and had no motivation to study. Even her grandmother observed that she did not even know how to read. Then her grandmother decided to pull her out of school to be homeschooled. At first, Cindy was very annoyed, but soon Cindy learned to read and write and was able to catch up in her studies. And finally, she returned to school and continued her classes. Sadly, on the final day of Cindy's senior year, when she came home to her grandmother had passed away. It was a life-changing moment for her, but she wanted to continue to make her grandmother proud. After high school, Cindy decided to become a bus driver. She always found happiness with the students she drove. Especially two particular students were her favorites because they always befriended a lonely student named Jackson on the bus. She was impressed by the children's behavior. She decided to write a letter to their parents to let them appreciate how wonderful children they had. She wanted to thank them for raising such rays of light in such a society. I'm writing to tell you how beautiful children you have inside and out. This can only come from the home, your patience and guidance, the examples that you set and teach. Cindy also added, I have a child on my bus named Jackson. Both of your children have shown him compassion and support. Every day your children ask if they can sit with Jackson. Further, sometimes Jackson is a little sad getting on the bus, but as soon as he sees Annalise and George, he smiles. Jackson has difficulties walking and it takes him a bit of time to get to his seat. Today, Annalise looked out from around her and said, Come on, Jackson, you can do it. Cindy continued her letter by stating, And when we arrived at school, George took it upon himself to carry his backpack. I know you know how wonderful your children are, but I wanted you to know that it shows. The children's parents were shocked after this note, and they replied, We would never have expected our child's bus driver to recognize them for their good deeds. It makes us feel wonderful knowing our kids are taking what we've taught them and being kind to their peers. Later on, George's parents decided to share the bus driver's note on social media. People of society also praised Cindy's recognition of the students, as well as the wonderful actions of her students. Cindy Clausen is just one bus driver, as others, but her act of kindness and recognizing her students is a great idea. That's all for today's stories. Please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and share the video with your friends.